fiends, their children too. And their children forever true.
Eight months after its initial release, the first and only expansion for Bloodborne has arrived from Software. The Old Hunters comes with a brand new arsenal of weapons, new attire for your character, new areas to explore, and new enemies to eviscerate. However, none of this would matter if From Software could not find a way to assemble all of these new ideas into a neatly tied bow. Thankfully, they pulled it off. Before we continue with the review, however, I think it is important to mention the steps in order to gain access to the Old Hunters content. While most game expansions can be accessed simply from the main menu, like the Left Behind DLC for The Last of Us, it is not so simple to access the Old Hunters in Bloodborne. In order to access it, you have to defeat two of the game's main bosses, collect an item from a character in the hub world, the Hunter's Dream, and then stand in a specific location to finally gain access to the expansion's content. I thought it was important to point this out to anyone who is considering purchasing the Old Hunters. While it does not affect the overall package, if you just want to play the expansion and avoid replaying the main game, there is no way around it. You should keep this in mind before making your purchase. Now, on to the main review. The Old Hunters is hard, and when I say hard, I mean hard even for Bloodborne standards. I had a pre-built character ready for the expansion, level 100 with an emphasis on strength and speed, and I still had difficulty playing through it. The expansion immediately introduces you to new enemy types that are based around the hunters you can fight in the main game. The difference, however, is that these hunters are equipped with the new weapons from the expansion. This gives even Bloodborne veterans a chance to grow their skills even more as they learn about the new enemy types and how to quickly dispatch them. There are also some returning enemies from the main game as well. While many of these enemies are welcome returns, the Brain Woman, known as the Winter Lantern, is not one. When I heard the Old Hunters was going to have new attire for the player to find, I was hoping they were going to include a form of attire that would allow you to be less vulnerable to the Winter Lantern's frenzy attack. It was a stat that I found to be a hindrance because it prevented you from fighting them. Your frenzy meter would fill up too quickly and then you'd have to back off and heal over and over again. They just were not that interesting of a character to fight. However, while playing around with these smaller enemies is fun, the juice of the combat comes from the intense boss battles. Bloodborne had some outstanding boss battles, but also a few that were subpar. From the battle with Vicar Amelia in the Grand Cathedral being one of the big standouts, as well as the battle against Ebritus below the Grand Cathedral. From Software is able to make some of the greatest boss fights in gaming, which is why it should be no surprise that they outdid themselves with the Old Hunters. I, of course, had high hopes for the expansion, but did not expect From Software to produce boss fights that not only exceeded the bosses of Bloodborne, but also many other AAA games out in the market. I came to this realization while facing the first boss, Ludwig. The fight started out pretty good. You were fighting against a giant beast like most bosses in Bloodborne. Then this happens.
You were at my side all along. My true mentor, my guiding moonlight.
suddenly, the entire fight changes from a standard monster battle to a fight against what can only be described as a giant Templar knight. It was at this moment that I could feel the hype, and if the expansion ended here, I would be okay with it. It has been a long time since I had a boss fight make me feel so invested in a fight until Ludwig pulled out his holy moonlight sword, and the musical accompaniment came in. This set the bar for the rest of the expansion, which it continued to achieve. There was one boss fight, however, that felt tacked on and unnecessary, if only because the rest of the fights were so much more interesting and engaging. The excellent level design from Bloodborne also returns for the old hunters. Everything is connected to each other and makes you want to explore every nook and cranny so you do not miss a shortcut to a safe lamppost. It is all very well layered out so that the player knows where they are supposed to be going. It is also thanks to the well-designed levels that enemy placement is not random locations, but rather at specific areas to keep the player on their toes. This also allows players to learn enemy movement and work around it if they need to make a speedy recovery. The expansion also expands on the lore and mythos of Bloodborne's story is based around. While it answers many of the lingering questions the game never fully answered, it also poses new ones. The Souls games, the series of games that Bloodborne is based on, is all about finding the story through objects in the game world. From the enemy and level designs, the NPCs you can meet in the game,
such is the nature of man,
and also the equipment descriptions. By doing so, From Software is able to build worlds that have a deep history and thus give the world its own life. As I described earlier while talking about the boss battle with Ludwig, the soundtrack for the Old Hunters is phenomenal. Unfortunately, there is no info yet about who is credited for the soundtrack for the expansion, but I would assume it was the same group that worked on Bloodborne. If it was, they pulled it off yet again. The original soundtrack did a great job of helping to set the tone of the world you were in. The use of the choir tracks alongside the orchestra and brass sections gave the music a church-like vibe, fitting alongside the premise of the game being based around a healing church. Tech-wise, I had very little issues. There were a few frame drops that I noticed during one of the boss fights, but it did not affect my playthrough. I also noticed a few walls seemed to load in a little late, but again, it did not affect my time with the Old Hunters. After all this praise that I've been giving the expansion, I would still only recommend it to people who are really into Bloodborne. The overall package exceeded my expectations, offering not only new weapons to try out, but also some of the greatest boss fights this console generation or of the last year. The problem, however, is that you really need to devote yourself to the game in order to play the expansion, which in the end is just more Bloodborne. That is not to say that more Bloodborne is bad. Bloodborne is a great game. But if you played Bloodborne and did not think it was the game for you, The Old Hunters is not going to change your mind. For those of you who are into Bloodborne, however, you need to get The Old Hunters. Not having it as part of your Bloodborne experience means that you are not receiving the whole experience of Bloodborne. You will not regret it.